Well, it seems like just a year ago at this time, and it was just a year ago at this time, I was back at Unity Village for our mid-year meetings, and our friend Tom Shepard had a new book that was just being released, and some of you know this guy, Tom Shepard. He was the minister at Sunrise Unity in Sacramento, and for the last 8 years he's been the professor of theology and church history at Unity Institute, which is our seminary in Unity back at Kansas City. And those of you who read Unity Magazine, and you do read Unity Magazine, do you not? I'll put in a plug for it here. That's our monthly magazine. He's got a monthly column called That's a Good Question. He takes questions from readers, which he then answers in the column. And I love it. It's one of my favorites. It's the first thing I read just about every month. Well, his latest book is called The Many Faces of Prayer: How the Human Family Meets Its Spiritual Needs. And on the back cover of the book, it says this. It says, praying to God, but which one? Praying to God, but which one? Now that's a good question. Prayer has many faces because God has many names. Do you know how many different entities have been called God by different cultures around the world throughout human history? I sure don't. Not a clue. Lots and lots is the best answer that I can come up with. More than we can even know, because every little unknown tribal village around the world had its own set of gods and goddesses and spirits that they called gods. And then you add to that the great civilizations of the world, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome. They all had their lineups of major and minor gods and goddesses. You know, in American culture today, one of the worst things that you can be called is the A word. An atheist. Ooh. I don't think it's so bad personally, but then I've never been much of a representative of the mainstream. But the fact is that the majority of Americans would not vote for a person unless they expressed a belief in God. They certainly wouldn't vote for a person who self-labeled as an atheist. And yet, when it comes to gods who were once in the mainstream, gods like Apollo, Poseidon, Zeus, Marduk, the list goes on and on and on, we're all atheists. And a lot of people say, oh, don't be silly, Reverend Mark. Of course, nobody still believes in those gods. At least not around these parts. You know, here in America, we know what we mean by God, right? And the conversation might go something like this. God, you know, the supreme being. Well, I'm not so sure I do know. What do you mean by supreme? What kind of a being do you have in mind? All depends on who you're talking to. Some folks have in mind a supernatural entity with human attributes who controls the weather and fixes football games. Seriously, you watch a few football games, and inevitably you're going to come across a player on the winning team at the end of the game who's being interviewed who will say something like, first of all, I want to thank the man upstairs for this wonderful victory. So, at least to that person, the supreme being is a male and has a favorite football team. There you go. I don't believe in that kind of a God. Does that make me an atheist? Maybe to that person, it does. It's an interesting conversation, isn't it? Other people just point to the Bible. They say, come on, you know, the book of Genesis, creation, the creator, Jesus. You know, the Bible. Genesis to Jesus. Wow, that's a lot of territory. How many different descriptions of God do we get when we go from the first words of Genesis all the way to Jesus and the Christian scriptures through the book of Revelation? It'll boggle the mind. Genesis starts out with a story of God who creates the world, the universe, people, everything in the world, and then calls it good. Just a few chapters after that, God hates everything that was just created and is out to destroy everyone and everything except, of course, for Noah and his family. There's the other stories that come later. God orders Joshua and his soldiers to attack a Canaanite city, and he's supposed to kill every living thing in it. Men, women, children, animals. Then we get to the end of the whole thing, the book of Revelation. Jesus is depicted as God, coming back with a sword coming out of his mouth. He's riding on a white horse, and in the story he proceeds to massacre the gathered armies of the beast, and so on and so forth. Now how could this possibly be the same guy who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, love your enemies, pray for those who oppress you, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do"? I might suggest that most of the people who point to the Bible for their version of God probably haven't read more than a few pages of that collection of books. All that confusion, and that's not just in our own culture. Multiply that by the many other cultures around the world, and it gets really complicated. The point here is that every so often, I think it's a really, really good idea to take some time to re-examine our God talk. And here's the good news. Nobody gets to tell you that you're wrong for doing that. I think one of the biggest reasons why people who self-label as atheists get such a bad rap is because some of them are amazingly insensitive, mean-spirited, maybe even downright nasty would be the right way of describing it. If you listen to some of them, if you go to church, or even something resembling a church, if the word God is a part of your vocabulary, if you say that you pray, now meditation is okay for them, but if you say that you pray, they call you things like deluded, ignorant, dangerous. That is no way to make friends and influence people. That's not a good way to connect with people and get your message out there. That's just another way of alienating people. For the most part, I am sympathetic to their cause and some of the things that they talk about. When religion and the name of God is used to justify terrorism, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or Buddhism, we need to speak out. When religion is used to justify discrimination and oppression, or when one religious group insists that the publicly supported schools in their country teach their version of creation and things like that, we need to step up. We need to speak out. So I hear what they're saying, but really, the folks who are doing those kind of things, they're just a tiny fraction of the billions of people around the world who identify with any of the major religions. The vast majority of the people who have a religion-based belief in some concept of God go about their lives quietly and peacefully. We accomplish nothing by calling them names. It's one of the major shortcomings that I find when I read books by these prominent atheist authors. What alternatives do they offer to the world? You can engage in a brilliant critique of, say, Islam. You can highlight all of the negative stuff that you want. And you can be spot on, factual, right, all those other things. There are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. They are not going away. They are not going to abandon their beliefs in response to your book. They're not going to disappear. Same thing goes for Christians, Jews, and any other group that they might care to target. They ain't going to change to suit our preferences. We end up doing a lot more harm, I think, than good when we try to ignore and marginalize billions of people instead of looking for ways to connect, to constructively engage. That's what we need to do. One of the things that Tom Shepard points out in his book, The Many Faces of Prayer, is that all of these different religions, with all of their different ideas and names for God, are all asking the same question. They're all asking the same question. Questions like this. It's slow. It's slow today. There we go. Same questions, different answers. The questions they all ask are, why are we here? What is the purpose of life? And what is ultimately most important and real? They all ask the same questions. However, they come up with different answers to the same questions for various reasons, cultural reasons and all sorts of other reasons. But, you know, as long as your God or your religion isn't telling you to bomb people who don't agree with you, as long as you're not trying to make me live according to the rules of your religion, can't we all get along? As long as you don't insist that your scriptures and your myths trump reality, we can all get along. So go ahead. If you want to insist, for example, that the sun revolves around the earth, well, you are, as a matter of fact and reality, simply wrong. Is the child who thinks Santa Claus is real right or wrong? Factually and in reality, wrong. But that's okay. When the time is right, truth and reality always prevail. So the many names of God are the many different ways we try to answer our universal questions that I just mentioned. So getting back to this idea of examining and re-examining our God talk, I'd like to suggest a new question to help us to guide us really in that examination. This is a question that was posed by Gene Marshall, who's a theologian whose work I just came across maybe about a year ago and started reading. So here's the question. He says that instead of asking whether or not God exists, we should ask, what reality are we pointing to with the word God? What reality are we pointing to? Is there something real in back of that word? Or are we just making stuff up in order to feel safe and secure? Is it real, or are we just pretending, just in case it turns out that hell is an actual place? It's a good question. It's a good thing to get in touch with. In Unity, we freely substitute all sorts of words for God, in case you hadn't noticed. Great. More names, right? Just what we need. More names for God. Yes, that's exactly what we need. More names, more flexibility, more ways to take God out of the box of our human limitations. So, we can refer to God as mind, principle, source, universe. Something else we say is one presence and one power. One presence, one power. Do we really mean it? That's another good question. Another good question to ask as we re-examine our God talk. One presence and one power. Do we really mean it? And what reality are we pointing to when we say that? Is it one presence and one power? Or do we look at the universe and then split it up into God and not God? So tempting, isn't it? So tempting to look at the things in the world that we label as bad or evil and say, not God. Things like war, crime, disease, natural disasters, the things that happen in the world that we call bad or we call evil, well, they're the result of misdirected human choices. Or they're simply the after effects of natural forces. That seems to be the price that we pay for this human experience, for this life. And for the most part, it's a pretty sweet life, isn't it? It's a precious gift that we sometimes don't appreciate until the disaster comes along, whatever it happens to be. Earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, tsunamis, they're tragic. But as I said before, we need to remember that the same energy that drives all those things, the same energy that drives the wind and the waves of a hurricane, is the same energy that sustains our life, that sustains all life on Earth. It's the same energy that holds the planets in their orbits. It's the same energy that gave birth to the stars, which is what gave birth to the building blocks of life. It's all one thing. It's all part of the same reality. So, what reality do we point to with the word God? All of it? Or only the parts we like? The pleasant stuff? Now that's the real challenge of spirituality. That's the challenge of spirituality, having to wrestle with questions like this. And if we're not wrestling with these questions, then are we really free? It's the greatest gift of spirituality, is the freedom to question, to explore, to find out for ourselves, so that we can have that experience at depth, so that when we say, yes, this is the reality that I point to when I use the word God, we'll know what that is. Not just based on what somebody filled our head with, but because we've taken the time to own it. That's what it's about. That's what spirituality is about. Religion will pour it into your head for you and order you not to question it. Spirituality says we explore it, we find it, we experience it, we own it. Life is. It's predictable. It's unpredictable. It's knowable. And it's mysterious. How do we experience the unpredictable and the mysterious? That's what it comes down to. Those things can be scary. They can be unpleasant. They can be painful. And we can spend a lifetime trying to avoid or deny or escape from those things. Or we can stand up and we can face them and we can contend with them. And we say that one of the most difficult things about unity is the personal responsibility that it requires of us. Unity is all about personal responsibility, and there comes a time when we have to jump into the deep end of the swimming pool. There's a time when we have to do that. And one of the names of God can help us to make that leap and to contend with the things that we might otherwise want to avoid. One presence, one power. Life, intelligence, everything and anything that we need to cope with the fullness of reality, the pleasant and the painful. We stop and we remind ourselves that we are the one presence and one power in action. It's how we came to be, part and parcel. Reality, all of it, one presence and one power. We're a lot stronger when we stand tall and claim that power and embrace the fullness of reality instead of denying that power and hiding in a corner and trying to pick and choose and push things away. The fullness of reality, all that stuff, isn't too much for us to embrace because that's what made us and that's what we're made for. So I want to close with a quote from one of my favorite authors who really sums things up here about as well as I've ever heard. This one is from Michael Dowd, who wrote this book called Thank God for Evolution. Here's what he says, and this is a good thing to remember in the face of things maybe that have you down or something that seems to be a challenge. He says, reality is not too tough for me. I was made for reality. This trust gives meaning to our lives. For me to look into the awe-filling fullness of life and pronounce the name God means a commitment of my life to reality-based living. All of it. Give it a try. See how it works. That's all we ask. See you next week.